Hello. I would have very much rather give this presentation in the class, and I probably will repeat it in the class so I could answer your question. But we are going to look at a series of slides based on um, a few principles of design. By now, I have already introduced you to some of the elements of the design, and principles of design are the organizing guideline that allow us to make a design that has a sense of um, uh, attractiveness and a sense that people want to spend time looking at. Some of the most common principles of design are the ones that I am going to explain and show to you in these slides. The first one, and perhaps the most common one, is repetition. In a good design, we do repeat same or similar elements in order for people to be able to grasp at and use things that similar, because those sense of similarity, which is also another principle of design, give a design a sense of cohesiveness and approachability. If we use elements that are consistently vastly different than each other, then our design can become very disorganized and chaotic. In the case of this one, we are seeing the repetition of the people. If you look at the repetition of the heads with the halos, we have repetition of trees here. And with that, we also have another principle of design, which is variety. So these repetitions are not necessarily repetition of same elements, but repetition of similar elements. So in a way, they have a sense of variety. We see even the sense of waves on the water are presented via repetition of patterns, the shadows here, but these shadows change in their sizes, in their intensities. These figures change in color of their clothing, the direction that they're using, the activities that they're doing. So here we can identify repetition, as in the head of the saints. We can identify variety because we see the colors and directions and faces change. The sizes of trees, they get smaller as they go back. And then we see similarities as well as a sense of closure. Here we have a cluster of figures. We have two figures that are working together, and these cluster of figures create a sense of rectangle, a horizontal rectangle, which is also repeated in the format of the mural. So now we go to the slide number 2. And this is School of Athens by Raphael. As you can see, these arches are all repeated within the structure as well as within the painting. You see a series of vertical lines that are repeated. The sky is repeated in 3 segments. The pattern on the ground is repeated. The figures are repeated, and then the clusters of figures also create again a similar shape to the format of the whole entire mural, and there is a strong horizontal emphasis. This is also what we call a closed composition, which means all the figures and everything, every part of the activity within the composition is happening inside. I'm pointing towards the inside of the composition. Michelangelo's creation of man, what we see is a figure that represents man, human, and a figure representing God from the heavens with angels, and then God reaching at the hand of man. This principle here, the closeness of these two hands coming together, we refer to as proximity. The proximity between these two hands actually comes and connects this composition. If we look at the composition, it seems like two centers of emphasis. So another one of the principles of design we talk about is emphasis. We also call it focal point, which means that the way when we first look at the design, we will actually what we end up looking at the most. And in this case, the cluster of figures of angels plus God being the only dressed figure within a kind of a vivid color background is probably our first focal point. And the second focal point is the figure of man, which is also the same scale. And then maybe the third focal point becomes the proximity of the two hands. We also, if we look at this in terms of design, there is another principle involved here we call continuity, and that is the fact that whatever we look at, perhaps we first look at God, the figure of God stretches out, and then we see series of lines and other things that brings us back. Then we kind of our eyes follow this curve. Not everybody's eyes does the same thing, but these are all calculated elements that are placed. So we would actually, from here, we go to the figure of the man, we'll look at the figure, and then we come down. We may actually pick up on the fact that this hand is here, and then the figure's leg being stretched this way, again, bring us back to the picture plane. Picture plane meaning the two-dimensional surface of art. Here we have a design that has a very dynamic sense of action happening. As you remember in the class, I talked about diagonal lines have a sense of action. We have a series of diagonals here. When we have a sense that some event is going to happen, something is going to fall, something is going to move, we also refer to that as a visual tension. That's another principle of art that is evident here. So as we identify, there is repetition of figures, and then there is repetition of diagonals. There's a strong diagonal emphasis, and all of these figures have elements that then can bring you back and lead you back into the picture plane. So you examine it, and that also gives it a sense of continuity. Then we go to a fairly minimalist design. Here is a photograph of a series of cups, and what we see is basically a series of rims of cups that are in gray tone, and then there is one we see that it has a blue light coming out of it. So here we have the repetition, and then we have a variety. And notice that when we have something unique, which is in this case is this light blue tone against all these other ones that are gray, it tends to give it more emphasis, and our eyes have a tendency to go toward that which is unique the most. Again, although it's a photograph, we have a series of repetition of birds. We have this diagonal, which actually makes the design more dynamic. If this was horizontal, the design would be more mundane, more banal. This diagonal line also repeats the diagonal line that is created through the edges of the head of the ducks. Here we have another design with the sense of repetition. And then there are variety. You notice that these designs of a little children, they're the ones that are dressed in a plain, no pattern. And then there are some that are designed to be wearing this stripe, and then the red ones. And the red ones tend to actually grab our attention the most, but also there is a sense of movement that is created. Movement is another principle of design, and a sense of rhythm. So when we have put repetition and movement together, it comes with a sense of rhythm, sense of visual beat that creates that sense of movement for us. This is Soup Cans by Andy Warhol. I personally find these the vast majority of work of Andy Warhol not that interesting. And this is when I'm showing you this, it's a image of a Campbell soup repeated, and that repetition creates a all-over pattern. But as you can see, an all-over pattern, when there is no variety, when there is not things that are different, when everything is homogeneous, it's very hard to stay focused and give it more interest. There is no real focal point in this design. Here we have the repetition and the variety, and notice how lively it becomes, even though it's all over pattern. The sense of variety has a sense of playfulness that we actually can enjoy about this design. This is by California artist Wayne Thiebaud, pop artist. Pop art actually tried to take the ordinary object and elevate them to the fine arts by presenting them in various paintings and very well done artworks that then went to museum. In essence, pop art tried to elevate the ordinary and the mundane to the high arts arena. And so what we see here are a series of ice cream. They're painted to look really frosty and creamy with a very, very thick paint. There's a repetition of 4 similar size, same size ice cream, but at the same time we see the color variety. Notice how the blue shadows actually provides a beautiful contrast. This is not made to make an exciting, dynamic composition. It actually is made to use subtleties of changes to actually give interest to the composition itself. Another example of combining repetition and variety, and then the yellow, vivid yellow color is what really creates a sense of dynamic emphasis within these circles, pattern circles, as well as vertical lines. Another work by Wayne Thiebaud, also again showing the repetition of display of pastry in the bakery, and this is very much based on repetition, but unlike Andy Warhol soup cans, there are subtle various things, such as the colors that you see here, changes here. This has some degree of diagonal emphasis, making the canvas a lot more interesting. This is a very good example of when we see principle of similarities at work. There are repetition of these forms, but they're not the same. They have, the whole overall design has a sense of similarities of electrical circuit boards. So I would say that this is becomes interesting by the way that it actually uses the sense of similarity and variety and repetition together to create something that is dynamic. This is actually, I believe, a logo for the Sound Lab. And so it's using things that have references to electrical and electronic sound and playfulness and digital, or basically both the movement of the sound as well as similarities to musical notes, but little icons of sound coming out. But most importantly, it has that sense of flow of electronics. This design I'm showing you because I find it to be really boring, but at the same time, this is just letter D repeated all over, in the same color. And then when you actually vary the change, that variety actually happens to create a focal point, get our attention. I talked about sense of closure. Principle of closure is when a sense of completion is created through the use of other elements. In this case, we don't really see an outline for this dog, Dalmatian dog, but we see this yellow circle patterns on the background, and where it comes to a stop, it actually starts creating the outline for the dog. So it's a sense of closure of creating the outline of the dog by sense of proximity of these yellow circles and then where they stop. Here we have again a series of very mundane lines, but then they become very interesting by these little bubbles that actually create a sense of optical illusion for us. On one side, the black lines continue to become bubbles, and here the white lines. That little bit of variety, similarity, and repetition is what makes this very simple design into a pretty pleasing thing to look at. Here again, we have similarities, repetition, and then we have a sense of movement that is created by shifting the direction, a sense of optical illusion. It appears to be three-dimensional, and then there is a sense of closure because of the way these are actually organized into little squares. This is basically nothing but a collection of lines that are using repetition, a variety, simplicity, similarity, and closure together to create this design. Here we are looking at M.C. Escher's work. This artist is very well known for pieces that are metamorphosized to something else. So we have these fish, and as the fish get more simple, the space in between them dissolves into these birds. And so in a way, it shifts from, fish to bird. Maybe he's talking about the evolution of species in a way. Here, a design these are more graphic, using text in little square blocks, but making them so large that it actually loses its true identity. This is the text that is not for reading, but as a visual element. And what we see is really these texts are placed in squares of white or black and then placed together and creates a very pleasing design again. And here we have another design that is created with text. Notice that there's a sense of similarity and repetition and variety. And this is the last that I'm going to show you of the series. What you see here, again, the word cool is written with a series of jagged lines, and the jagged lines are actually repeated frequently to create a sense of repetition, as well as their direction changes, sense of variety. The fact that all of these actually fit within their own square, and then they're side together to create a larger horizontal design. Again, there is a repetition of the squares within the composition. And then the thing that has a tendency probably to stand out a little more is this area where these lines are far more organized and less chaotic than the other ones. So this concludes this slide presentations, a little bit of analysis.